Okay, welcome back. The subject of this video is going to be introducing you guys to the animal cell. Now, when we're talking about human anatomy and physiology, this is where we start out. The cell is the basic unit of life. Animal cell is going to differ from a plant cell in a lot of different ways. First and foremost, and the easiest way to tell them apart is the presence or absence of a cell wall. A plant has a very rigid cell wall on the outside, and that helps give the plant still a structure and support to the plant, whereas an animal cell does not have a cell wall. They kind of look a little bit more fluid, and oftentimes you see them drawn kind of in a circular shape or an irregular shape, whereas a plant cell will usually be drawn in some type of rectangle or a square-ish shape because of the cell wall. So a cell is the simplest structure that shows us the basic processes of life. So every cell will have growth to a certain extent. It will show reproduction, and we'll talk about that later in this unit. And it'll also have many metabolic reactions that take place in there. Now, animal cells will always live together in the tissue. They don't live by themselves. They make up a bigger organism. But we can have cells that are free living. So one cell equals one organism. As we'll see with bacterial cells are always unicellular, and protozoa, or the protists, there are single-celled life forms of protists that exist. And in fact, some of the most important parasites to humans are protists, and they're single-cell organisms. Malaria is an example. Now, we're talking about cells in the human body. We're talking about around 200 different cell types, and those cell types will have a specific function, and they can go like the slide is saying here, from the formation of bone, so producing bone material, to repelling disease, so part of our immune system. We'll also have neurons that are in our nervous system that conduct impulses, collect information from the outside world, send information from the brain to react to that. You'll also have cardiac cells that control the heart and major blood vessels. And like I said, there's around 200 different types of cells in our body. Each one of those has a different function. Now, when we're studying cells, the branch of biology that studies cells is called cytology. So if you break that down, like we always like to do with words in biology, CYT, cyte or cyto, that usually means a cell, and ology means the study of. So cytology is the study of cells, quite simple. And one of our most important tools when we're studying cells is, of course, the microscope. Now, we're going to use a microscope in our first lab, and we're going to hopefully get you guys really familiar with them, so you find it easy, second nature to use it when we move on to the rest of our labs. And we have to use a microscope when we're talking about stuff that's too small for us to see with our naked eye. The type of microscopes we use in the lab are going to be these compound light microscopes, and that's going to give us at the maximum 1,000 times magnification. Okay, and X is the symbol for magnification. The next two types of microscope here, these are as you can see, electron microscopes. So those microscopes aren't even going to use light in order to see. They're going to use a beam of electrons. Now, when we're talking about electron microscopes, now we're talking about really high powered microscopes. So you can have a resolution of these microscopes down to 0.2 nanometers, and a nanometer is 10 to the negative 9 meters. And then when we're looking at our compound light microscope, we're still looking at micrometers, which is 10 to the negative 6. So much bigger, way better resolution on the electron microscopes. We can also see magnifications of around 1,000,000 times when we're talking about electron microscopes, so we can see stuff that are very small. Yesterday I had a student ask me if we could see COVID under our light microscopes, and no, we cannot. COVID's a virus, so it's way smaller than what we can see, what resolution we have. But if we use some really powerful electron microscopes, then then we can actually see COVID. And you've probably seen pictures in the news. Okay, so this is a look at something we'd see from different types of microscopes. If we look at figure A, this is going to be, I think, around 400 times magnification, somewhere around there. And this is what we'll see on our typical light microscopes like we're going to use in the lab. If we're trying to keep stuff for scale, they're showing on the very top of the cell up here, we see these tiny threads, and those are cilia, which are little tiny finger-like projections that help move stuff around on the cell. Now, at our compound light microscope, we can see a whole cell. So we're talking about, this is going to be a whole cell. We've got our nucleus, we've got our cell membrane, and there's little cilia on the outside. This is probably from the inside of our respiratory system. Now, if we switch to electron microscopes, which these two are here, we're going to go from seeing the whole picture on this slide to just this area right here. So we increase the magnification. This is what we're going to get over here. And then this microscope right here is most likely a transmission electron microscope. And a transmission electron microscopes allow you to see pictures in 2 dimensions. So 2D for this one, and on our compound light microscopes we're only going to see a 2D image. If we switch to a scanning electron microscope, now we're seeing the same thing. So the same picture is going to be over here, but now we're seeing it in a 3D image. So a transmission electron microscope will pass electrons through and we'll get a 2D image. A transmission electron microscope will bounce electrons off the surface and we'll end up with a 3D image. So really cool when you get into different aspects of microscopy. Electron microscopes are really expensive, but they produce some absolutely amazing micrographs. Okay, so here's a look at a typical animal cell. A lot of times you'll see them drawn as a cartoon like this, and then we've got a list of the different parts that make up the cell. If we have a look through this, there's a lot of different little structures here, and each one of these structures are we generally refer to them as organelles. An organelle means, well, a tiny organ, but it's not officially an organ, of course, because you need many cells to make up an organ. But these little tiny bits and pieces of the cells that we call organelles, they each have their own function. So they do different things within the cell that contribute to the everyday life of the cell, the overall cell's metabolism, so on and so forth. So I have included a worksheet in your Unit 2 stuff that'll help you organize the different organelles and their function. So I suggest you have a look at that, download it and fill it out. Maybe keeping all your thoughts of the organelles in the same place might make it easier to study. But we can look at all these different parts: the plasma membrane, the centrioles, lysosomes, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, RER, and you also have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the SER. We'll have vesicles, different types of vesicles like peroxisomes and lysosomes. We'll have ribosomes, cilia that we talked about, we looked at in the last picture. Microvilli come up on certain cells. Mitochondria, which are very important in terms of producing energy. The Golgi apparatus, the nuclear membrane, the nucleolus, and the nucleus. So you guys will be responsible for knowing what those parts look like on the cell and what their functions are. Now we'll go through that through different parts of this unit, and certainly we'll move into more in depth as we get into the next unit, so we talk about histology, studying tissues. So have a look at that review sheet. You've got all the organelles listed, and then you need to find their function. So let's have a look at some of these and talk them through. Now, starting on the outside of the cell, we have the plasma membrane. Now, some textbooks will call it the cell membrane, but I think we've mostly moved to calling it a plasma membrane now. And the plasma membrane is really important because it provides a border, an enclosed space for all the living processes that happen inside of it. Okay, so it encloses all the cell contents, and by doing that, it does a major role in regulating what leaves and what enters the cell. The cell, if you think of the cell like a factory, it needs to have materials bought into it so it can build things, so it can undergo regular chemical reactions. Like, it needs like oxygen, it would need nutrients, it would need things that can help it produce energy. So all of these things have to be able to get into the cell. Now, just like any factory, at the end of the day, there's going to be stuff that the cell doesn't need anymore. It's going to be waste. And that waste also has to leave the cell because there's A, probably no space for it, and B, sometimes building up waste can be a really dangerous thing. You can have molecules that aren't healthy, so we need to get rid of it, and we pass it on to a different type of cell that helps break it down. So the plasma membrane performs a very important regulatory function because it regulates what can get in and get out of the cell. Now, the membrane itself is made up of lipids. Now, we talked about lipids a couple of slides ago. We talked about how we had a hydrophobic, so a part that were afraid of water, and a hydrophilic, which is a part that was, loved water. And very often you'll see lipids drawn like this. They'll have a circle there for a head, and then they'll have two long chains that stick off of them like this. Now, this end here is the hydrophilic end. So this part up here loves the water, and then these parts right here, that's the hydrophobic. Whoops. So this part of the lipid hates water. So the way they arrange themselves is the hydrophilic end will go to the outside and the hydrophobic end go to the inside. So if we look down here, and I just draw kind of a bigger version of that, we'll have the head of the lipid here, and then we'll have the two hydrophilic ends, and then we'll have the head of the lipid here, and then the two hydrophilic ends. So this area right here is going to be the inside of the membrane, and this is going to be probably to the outside of the cell, and this will probably be to the inside of the cell. So you can see how it structurally forms. Another really important thing about the cell membrane is it has a lot of things attached to it, and it's fluid. So these things that are attached to it, they can move in around and amongst the lipid molecules that make up the membrane. So it's a really fascinating structure to study on a molecular level. You'll have these sugar side chains, like the ones down here that are shaped like a Y, and these will act as signals. They'll act as a way for cells to communicate back and forth to each other. They'll help protect the cell from the immune system, so on and so forth. You'll also have these big proteins here that will go inside the cell membrane, and they can pass right in and out, and they can help regulate what gets in and what gets out of the cell. So the plasma membrane is a very important structure when we're talking about the overall health and functioning of the cell. Now, once we get inside the plasma membrane, the cell is mostly made up of a ball of fluid, and we call that fluid the cytoplasm. Now, inside the cytoplasm, we're going to have all of these different organelles. The cytosol is the part of the cytoplasm that's just fluid. Okay, the rest of the rest that make up the cytoplasm are going to be all of these organelles. So I've got this table on here, so it kind of fills in some of the functions of these organelles, and I'm going to talk about them as we move on through this unit, and certainly we'll be talking about the organelles as we move into the next unit, unit 3.